education and training. In ancient Athens, education wasn't just a luxury. It was a matter of civic duty, at least for boys. A well-educated man wasn't simply a scholar. He was a vital piece of the Athenian democratic machine. But as much as Athens cherished its schools of thought, the approach to education was far from equal. Boys and girls had vastly different paths, shaped by societal expectations. For Athenian boys, education began at the age of 7, and it was a holistic affair. Boys didn't just learn their letters and numbers. They were trained in music, gymnastics, and rhetoric, the ancient trifecta of well-roundedness. In fact, if you ever stumbled upon a conversation in Athens, chances are it wasn't just a discussion, but a full-on rhetorical performance, complete with gesticulations and a strong sense of, "Let me show you why I'm smarter." Young boys had to learn the art of convincing an audience, which in Athens happened to be a necessity if you ever planned to have any success in the assembly. The education of boys also had a physical component. The Gymnasium was a crucial institution where boys trained their bodies to match their minds. And no, this wasn't your average 21st century gym session with treadmills and protein shakes. Boys wrestled, ran, and even practiced military drills. The reasoning? A strong body made for a strong citizen, and a weak one could hardly lead troops or vote on matters of war and peace. Girls, however, were in for a different kind of training. Their education took place at home and was less about debate skills and more about domestic life. While boys were debating the finer points of Homer, girls were learning to manage the household, weave, and prepare for marriage. Mothers taught their daughters how to run a home, spin wool, and take care of children, a curriculum that might not have involved philosophy, but certainly took discipline. After all, running an efficient oikos, household, required serious multitasking skills. Funny insight. In Athens, boys were training to win debates and defend democracy. Girls, on the other hand, were getting ready to ensure the laundry didn't start a domestic uprising. While the gender divide in education was stark, it wasn't because Athenian society devalued the role of women. Quite the contrary. The household was seen as the bedrock of the polis, and managing it well was critical to keeping Athenian society running smoothly. If anything, women's role in managing the home allowed men the freedom to go about their business in the Agora, the assembly, or the courts. In summary, education in ancient Athens was a reflection of the city-state's values. Boys were trained for public life, ensuring they could contribute to politics and war, while girls were prepared for domestic duties, reinforcing the social structures of the time. And while this divide might seem limiting, it was simply the norm in a society where civic life was reserved for men and the home was seen as women's domain. Work and economy. Athenian life wasn't all philosophy and politics. Someone had to keep the wheels of the city turning. For most Athenians, daily life meant work, and that work spanned across a variety of industries. Agriculture, craftsmanship, and trade were the lifeblood of the economy, and much of the population engaged in these pursuits to make a living. For many, farming was the backbone of Athenian society. In the rural areas surrounding the city, farmers cultivated wheat, barley, olives, and grapes, the latter of which were essential for that most prized of Athenian pastimes, drinking wine. And while it might sound like a peaceful life, farming wasn't easy. The land around Athens wasn't always cooperative, and a bad harvest could spell disaster for a family. Within the city walls, craftsmen and artisans played a central role. From potters to blacksmiths, their work was both practical and artistic. Take the famous Athenian vases, not just kitchenware, but pieces of art that found their way to far-flung parts of the Mediterranean. Every potter hoped that their creations would make it to a wealthy patron's home, or be admired in a marketplace. Athenians took great pride in their pottery, and even today, you'll find museums packed with these iconic vessels. One wonders if ancient potters ever thought, In 2,000 years, this amphora will be behind glass. No pressure, right? The Agora, Athens' bustling marketplace, was the center of all trade and commerce. Here, merchants from all over the Greek world and beyond sold their goods, everything from olive oil to exotic spices. Picture a modern-day shopping mall, but instead of food courts and clothing stores, it was open-air stalls filled with everything you could imagine. The Agora wasn't just a place to buy and sell. It was also where citizens exchanged ideas, gossiped about politics, and no doubt made a few sarcastic comments about the state of the city's leadership. For the medics, life in Athens offered opportunities and challenges. These resident foreigners, often traders or skilled laborers, were essential to the Athenian economy. However, despite their contributions, they were never afforded the full rights of citizenship. Medics could own businesses but not land, and they had to pay taxes without any say in political matters. It was the ancient equivalent of being a permanent guest at a party. You could enjoy the wine and conversation, but you weren't allowed to help pick the music or the guest list. Slaves, as mentioned earlier, were at the very bottom of the social and economic ladder. They worked in nearly every sector of society: agriculture, households, workshops, and even in the notoriously harsh conditions of Athenian silver mines. Yet, despite their low status, some slaves were trusted with important responsibilities, and a few even managed to buy their freedom over time. In conclusion, the economy of Athens was as complex and interconnected as its political system. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and slaves all played their part in keeping the city's heart beating. Behind every Athenian debate about democracy, there were countless workers ensuring that the city didn't grind to a halt. And though some might have envied the lofty debates of the Agora, these everyday Athenians knew that while philosophy could fill the mind, it didn't exactly fill the stomach. Religion and cultural practices. Religion was woven into every aspect of Athenian life. Whether you were a farmer, a politician, or a craftsman, your day likely started and ended with a prayer to the gods. The Athenians believed that the gods had a hand in everything, from the weather and harvests to wars and political outcomes. It's safe to say that in ancient Athens, pleasing the gods was serious business. And for that, you needed a festival, lots of them. The Panathenaea, held annually in honor of Athena, was the largest and most important festival in Athens. Imagine it as a combination of Mardi Gras and the Olympics, with sacrifices, processions, athletic competitions, and of course, plenty of effie. Every citizen was expected to participate, and the whole city would come alive with activity. The highlight? A grand procession up to the Acropolis, where a new peplos, a ceremonial robe, would be presented to the statue of Athena. It wasn't just about fun and games. It was a reminder that the gods played an integral role in every aspect of life. But not all religious practices were about large festivals. Every household had its domestic rituals, with small altars dedicated to family gods or ancestors. Daily offerings of food, wine, or incense were made to ensure the family's prosperity and protection. These simple acts might not have had the grandeur of the public festivals, but for Athenians, they were essential in keeping the divine favor close to home. When Athenians needed more direct answers from the gods, they'd turn to oracles. The Oracle of Delphi was the most famous, and people traveled from all over the Greek world to consult the Pythia, the high priestess who spoke for Apollo. Getting advice from the oracle, however, wasn't always straightforward. Her prophecies were often cryptic and open to interpretation, kind of like ancient fortune cookies, but with much higher stakes. Athens was also famous for its theatrical festivals, which blended entertainment with religious devotion. The city Dionysia, a festival in honor of Dionysus, god of wine and theater, featured dramatic performances that tackled deep philosophical and social issues. Tragedies by Sophocles and Euripides weren't just stories, they were moral lessons, exploring the consequences of hubris, fate, and divine intervention. And while the tragedies were heavy, the comedies provided much-needed comic relief. Comedians like Aristophanes weren't afraid to poke fun at politicians or the absurdity of life. Think of it as ancient Greece's version of political satire, only with more references to goats. If the gods didn't smile upon you after a tragedy, at least you could count on a comedy to lighten the mood. What better way to end a divine festival than with a good roast, especially when the butt of the joke was your least favorite politician? In essence, religion in Athens was everywhere, in the city's politics, its art, and even in its jokes. The Athenians saw no clear division between the spiritual and the material world. Instead, the two were intertwined. Life was, after all, a performance meant to please the gods, whether it was through piety or a good laugh. Political participation. Democracy, the shining achievement of Athens and the envy of ancient city-states everywhere. But before you picture a modern election with campaign speeches, debates, and slogans, let's take a step back. Athenian democracy looked a bit different. First of all, it wasn't a representative democracy like what we're familiar with today. There were no elected officials to speak on your behalf. No, Athenians believed in getting their hands dirty in politics. Every citizen, every male citizen over 18, was expected to participate directly in the running of the state. That meant if you were eligible, you didn't just have the right to vote. You were basically expected to show up and help make the laws. The heart of Athenian democracy was the assembly, or ecclesia, where citizens gathered to discuss and vote on everything from military decisions to new laws. The assembly was open to any free Athenian male, and meetings took place 40 times a year on the Myx Hill. Picture this: thousands of men crammed together, each one ready to voice their opinion. No microphones, no Twitter debates, just good old-fashioned yelling. If the idea of a chaotic mass debate sounds like a logistical nightmare, you wouldn't be far off. But for Athenians, it was a beautiful mess. They considered it the purest form of democracy, letting every voice be heard, whether it was an eloquent speech or a grumpy old man ranting about taxes. However, before you think the assembly was just a free-for-all where anyone could speak endlessly, Athens had rules. Citizens were given a limited time to speak, and there were officials who ensured that order was kept. Often, skilled orators took center stage, delivering persuasive arguments that could sway public opinion. If you weren't great at speaking, don't worry. Someone would probably throw a few tomatoes, metaphorically speaking. In addition to the assembly, there were juries and councils that made up other parts of the political system. The Council of 500, the Boule, was responsible for setting the agenda for the assembly, and its members were chosen by lottery. Yes, by lottery. It wasn't about who was the most qualified, but about giving everyone a fair shot at political participation. In fact, the Athenians believed that selecting people by chance was the most democratic way to avoid corruption. Though if you think about it, imagine pulling your name out of a hat one day only to discover you're suddenly responsible for running the city. Not quite what most people hope for in a lottery. Then there were the law courts, where citizens acted as jurors. Athenian juries could be massive, up to 500 people. Try convincing that many people you're innocent. Trials could last all day, with no lawyers, just the accused and the accuser presenting their cases. The jury would then vote, and the majority ruled. If you ever wanted to see democracy in action, Athens' courts were a sight to behold. If you thought trying to reach a consensus with your family over dinner was hard, try getting 500 Athenians to agree on a verdict in a trial. It's no wonder they needed a lot of wine after that. Of course, Athenian democracy wasn't without its flaws. Women, slaves, and metics, resident foreigners, were all excluded from the process. And while it was theoretically a system where every citizen had an equal voice, in practice, the wealthier, more educated men often held more sway. Still, for its time, Athenian democracy was revolutionary. The idea that ordinary people could gather, debate, and directly influence their government was radical, and its influence can still be felt today. In conclusion, political participation in Athens was both a right and a responsibility. Athenians took pride in their direct involvement in the governance of the city, even if it meant long days of debating under the hot sun. And while not everyone had a voice, for those who did, it was a unique opportunity to shape the future of their city. Leisure and entertainment. Sure, Athenians worked hard, debated harder, and fought wars, but they also knew how to have a good time. Leisure and entertainment weren't just distractions from the daily grind. They were essential to the rhythm of Athenian life. In a city where everyone seemed to have an opinion about everything, even relaxation was approached with a kind of civic duty. One of the most famous forms of entertainment was the theater, and when Athenians said theater, they weren't talking about a casual night out to watch a rom-com. This was the real deal. Entire festivals were dedicated to drama, especially during the city Dionysia in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine and theater. Thousands of Athenians would gather in the open-air theaters to watch tragedies and comedies, written by the likes of Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes. Tragedy was where the Athenians really got to indulge in their love for drama. Picture this: a chorus chanting ominously, heroes wrestling with their fate, and lots of deep existential questions like, why do the gods hate me? And what does it mean to be human? These plays weren't just for entertainment. They were a reflection of Athenian values, fears, and philosophical questions. If you thought Netflix's dark and gritty shows were intense, the Athenians were doing it first and live. On the flip side, comedies provided some much-needed levity. Aristophanes, for example, didn't hold back when it came to making fun of politicians, philosophers, and even the gods. If you thought political satire was a modern invention, think again. Athenians loved nothing more than a good laugh at the expense of their leaders. Aristophanes once even depicted Socrates as a bumbling fool in his play The Clouds, which probably didn't help Socrates' reputation much later on. But it wasn't all about the drama. Athenians were also athletes, and sports were a big part of their leisure activities. The Panathenaic Games, held every 4 years in honor of Athena, were a major event, featuring races, wrestling, and chariot competitions. Much like the Olympic Games, which had their origins in ancient Greece, these athletic competitions were about more than just winning. They were a way of honoring the gods and celebrating physical excellence. Winning one of these games wasn't just about bragging rights. It was about bringing glory to your city and yourself. Symposia, or drinking parties, were another popular way Athenians spent their leisure time. But before you imagine a wild frat party, symposia were more structured affairs, at least in the beginning. These gatherings involved drinking wine, mixed with water, no one drank it straight, eating, and having intellectual conversations. Guests reclined on couches while discussing politics, philosophy, and, after enough wine, probably some questionable poetry recitations. It was an opportunity for the elite to relax, bond, and of course show off their wit. Leisure wasn't confined to just the wealthy either. The Agora was a lively hub of social interaction. People from all walks of life would gather to shop, exchange gossip, and watch impromptu performances by street entertainers. For many Athenians, the Agora was the place to, whether you were debating politics, grabbing a quick bite, or simply people-watching, it was the beating heart of public life. In conclusion, leisure and entertainment in Athens weren't just about taking a break from the daily grind. They were an integral part of civic and social life. Whether watching a tragedy unfold in the theater or cheering at a wrestling match, Athenians knew how to turn relaxation into an art form. And if a little wine was involved, all the better. Health and medicine. When it came to health and medicine in ancient Athens, it was a bit of a mix between science and, well, divine intervention. Sure, there were physicians who could stitch you up and prescribe treatments, but if you were feeling under the weather, you might just as easily find yourself praying to the gods for a cure as popping into the local healer's clinic. It's not quite the take two of these and call me in the morning approach we're used to today. One of the most revered figures in medicine was Asclepius, the god of healing. His sanctuaries, known as Asclepiae, were essentially ancient health spas where people would come to recover. These weren't your typical temples. Patients would undergo what was called incubation. No, not that kind of incubation, where they'd sleep in the temple, hoping Asclepius would visit them in their dreams and reveal a cure. Dream therapy, ancient Greek style. Now, as wonderful as a divine visit sounds, not all Athenians put their faith solely in dreams. Enter Hippocrates, the man often called the father of medicine. While there's debate about how much of what is attributed to him was actually written by him, Hippocrates and his followers took a more rational approach to illness. He emphasized the idea that disease wasn't a punishment from the gods, but something that could be understood and treated. This was revolutionary thinking for the time, basically like telling people today, you don't need crystals and horoscopes, just wash your hands. Hippocratic medicine was based on the idea of balancing the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you had a fever, maybe your humors were out of balance. Treatment? Bloodletting or a change in diet might be in order. And if that didn't work, there was always a nice herbal concoction, or if things got desperate, some pretty questionable animal-based remedies. Still, this was a huge leap forward from just shaking a rattle at an illness. If you had a headache in ancient Athens, they might have suggested balancing your humors. Modern version: have you tried drinking water and getting more sleep? Some things never change. Medical care wasn't just for the wealthy either. Many Athenians had access to some form of health care, whether from private physicians or community healers. However, just like today, quality care varied depending on your social status. Wealthier families could afford personal doctors who made house calls, while the average citizen might rely on public physicians or head to an Asclepian for some divine intervention. Childbirth, in particular, was a risky business, and it was primarily in the hands of midwives. These women had significant expertise in managing deliveries and dealing with complications, considering the medical limitations of the time. But even with the best care, maternal and infant mortality rates were high. A lot of the advice handed down to expectant mothers was a combination of practical knowledge and old wives' tales. A reminder that in ancient Greece, like in many ancient societies, childbirth was as much a spiritual event as a medical one. Despite the advancements made by thinkers like Hippocrates, much of Athenian healthcare was still influenced by superstition and religion. People would frequently seek guidance from oracles or make offerings to gods and goddesses for good health. Herbs and natural remedies were commonly used for treatments, but if the illness persisted, it wasn't unusual to see people flocking to temples for divine intervention as a last resort. In conclusion, health and medicine in Athens were a blend of science, spirituality, and sometimes just plain guesswork. While doctors like Hippocrates were laying the groundwork for modern medicine, most Athenians still kept one foot firmly planted in the divine. Whether it was the temple or the clinic, the Athenian approach to health reflected their deep connection to both the physical and the metaphysical world. Gender relations. In the male-dominated world of ancient Athens, women's roles were, how can I put this delicately, a bit limited. Okay, very limited. Women were expected to focus on domestic duties and rarely ventured into the public sphere. While men were busy philosophizing in the Agora, women were mostly confined to the household, responsible for managing the oikos, home, and raising children. It wasn't exactly a lifestyle of power lunches and yoga classes. Athenian society was patriarchal, meaning that men held authority both in public and private life. Citizenship was exclusively male, and only freeborn men had the right to participate in politics or own property. women's legal status was tied to a male guardian, either their father, husband, or, in some cases, their sons. The idea was that women needed protection and supervision, not independence. Now, before we completely write off the lives of Athenian women as grim and boring, it's worth noting that they did have influence within their own sphere. A wife's responsibility for managing the household was no small task. She oversaw everything from finances to food production, especially in wealthier homes where there were slaves or servants to manage. And while Athenian women were excluded from formal education, many were educated informally at home, particularly in households that valued. Marriage in Athens was more of a social contract than a love match. Most girls married between the ages of 14 and 18, usually to older men who could provide financially. The primary goal of marriage? Producing legitimate heirs, preferably sons, who could carry on the family name and inherit property. Daughters, on the other hand, were considered a bit of a financial liability, as families had to provide dowries when they married. But while Athenian women didn't have the freedom of their male counterparts, they weren't entirely powerless. Wealthy women, in particular, could exert influence through their families. Some women participated in religious festivals and cults, which offered them a public role, albeit a limited one. For example, women were essential in religious rituals like those of the Thesmophoria, a festival dedicated to Demeter, the goddess of agriculture and fertility. These events allowed women to step out of their domestic roles and into a communal space where they could connect with other women and engage in activities that carried significant cultural and religious meaning. Oh, if you were a woman in ancient Athens, you weren't heading to the Knicks to vote, but you might get to lead a procession at the next Demeter festival, if you played your cards right. However, despite these small areas of influence, women's lives in Athens were largely controlled by the men around them. They were rarely seen in public, and when they were, it was usually for religious festivals or family occasions. Women were also barred from most forms of property ownership, and their legal rights were minimal. If they wanted to bring a legal case, they had to do so through a male relative. Interestingly, while Athenian women were often portrayed in plays and literature, these depictions were rarely flattering. Female characters in comedies, especially those written by Aristophanes, were often exaggerated for comedic effect, portrayed as gossipy, overly sexual, or conniving. In tragedies, however, women like Antigone or Medea were often given more complex and sympathetic roles, though they still operated within the confines of their societal expectations. In conclusion, gender relations in ancient Athens were heavily skewed in favor of men, but women played crucial roles in managing households and participating in religious life. Despite their limited public roles, women's influence in domestic and religious spheres was significant, even if largely unrecognized by the society at large. Impact of war. What was it good for in ancient Athens? Well, aside from the obvious destruction and loss, it turns out war significantly shaped the city-states. Athens was no stranger to conflict, and the effects of warfare were deeply embedded in the daily lives of its citizens. From the triumphs against Persia to the devastating losses in the Peloponnesian War, these battles left an indelible mark on Athenian society. Let's start with the Persian Wars. For many Athenians, these wars were the stuff of legends, particularly the victory at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. Athenian hoplites, soldiers, managed to fend off the much larger Persian forces, and this victory became a source of immense pride. It wasn't just about defeating the Persians, it was about protecting democracy, freedom, and, let's face it, bragging rights. The victory inspired art, literature, and even some pretty lofty speeches by politicians eager to remind everyone just how heroic they all were. You could almost hear the collective, "We're number one," being chanted across the Agora. The aftermath of the Persian Wars also had a huge economic impact. Athens became the leader of the Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states created to defend against future Persian threats. Athens, being the most powerful member, took control of the league's treasury and used these funds to build its empire. This wealth allowed the city to embark on some major building projects, including the construction of the Parthenon. It was like the ancient world's version of a post-war economic boom, except instead of highways and shopping malls, they were putting up marble temples and gigantic statues of Athena. The Athenians took the Delian League's money and said, "Thanks, we'll keep it safe. In our brand new Parthenon, complete with statues, columns, and marble floors. And, by the way, we won't be giving it back anytime soon." Classic ancient world accounting. But not all wars ended with Golden Age prosperity. The Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, was a whole different story. This long and bloody conflict between Athens and Sparta dragged on for decades, and Athens came out on the losing end. The war not only drained the city's coffers, but also shattered the social fabric. Gone were the days of democratic ideals and artistic flourishing. The war decimated the population, left the economy in tatters, and shook the citizens' confidence in their once glorious city. Perhaps the most catastrophic event during the war was the Plague of Athens in 430 BCE. As if war wasn't bad enough, a mysterious plague swept through the city, killing thousands, including the great leader Pericles. The plague exposed the vulnerability of the Athenian population, especially in a city where people were crammed together for protection behind walls as the Spartan army camped outside. The emotional and psychological toll was immense, leading to a breakdown in societal norms. Athens, once proud and thriving, was now suffering from internal divisions, loss of morale, and widespread despair. Despite these setbacks, the Athenians didn't give up easily. They fought on for years, but the eventual surrender to Sparta in 404 BCE marked the end of Athens' golden age. The war left deep scars, not just on the city itself, but also on the psyche of its citizens. The once invincible Athens had been humbled, and the impact of this defeat reverberated through the years. However, in typical Athenian fashion, the city didn't completely fall apart. The resilience of its people meant that, while the war marked the end of its imperial ambitions, Athens remained a cultural and intellectual hub for centuries. Democracy would be restored, though in a more limited form, and the legacy of Athenian thought and art would continue to influence the world long after the last Spartan left the city. In conclusion, the impact of war on Athens was multifaceted. While victories like those in the Persian Wars brought wealth, pride, and cultural flourishing, conflicts like the Peloponnesian War led to devastation, loss of morale, and a decline in political stability. Yet, through it all, Athens remained a city that inspired future generations with its resilience, creativity, and commitment to the ideals that had made it great.
By my side, intense, strong, no fear to face, nowhere to hide, intense. I subscribe to this channel, click like today, because content like this just lights my way, intense and slow.